My name is Carolyn Taylor and I work here at the BC Forest Discovery Centre. I am a museum assistant. Right now we are in our logging camp. Our logging camp consists of bunkhouses. These two are from the Nanaimo River operation and the ones behind me are from Copper Canyon. Even though they all look the same, these bunkhouses all had different specifications in the camp. This one here happens to be the cookhouse, and you can tell it's the cookhouse because there is a gut hammer, which is a triangle, hanging from the door. Loggers had lots of interesting slang and things that they used for things in their camp, and I'll be teaching some of it to you as we go along today. In a logging camp, loggers would actually work in a camp that paid them less money if it fed them better food. So the cook is an incredibly important man in the camp. He's making about $4.50 a day in 1936, which in 1936 was a pretty decent wage. The cook couldn't prepare all the food by himself. He needed help. And the reason for that is loggers are eating up to 9,000 calories a day. So in one meal, they're eating as many calories as you or I would eat in an entire day. So the cook has help. There's someone called the flunky who works here in the cookhouse with the cook. And his job, one of his jobs, is to get up at 3 a.m. and come in here and start peeling potatoes for the morning meal. The cook also has someone called the kitchen mechanic. And the kitchen mechanic, as you may be able to guess, is someone who washes and dries the dishes. And then there's the bull cook, and the bull cook is a man who works in the camp but isn't actually part of the cookhouse. His job is to bring firewood in for the fire and keep the fire going all day long. We have a menu on the wall that shows the last meal cooked by a camp in 1982. And the courses are bean and bacon soup, deep fried shrimp, beef short ribs, hamburgers and onions, mashed potatoes, french fries with gravy, asparagus tips, carrots, apricot cheesecake, and if you still have room, there is fruit for dessert. This is the dining hall. This is where the loggers would have eaten breakfast and dinner. Lunch they ate out in the woods, and lunch was leftovers from the day before. And they carried it out in this big box that they called a coffin. And we don't know if they called it a coffin because it was really heavy and it felt like it had a body in it, or because the box looked like a coffin, or because the food was dead because they'd eaten it the night before. So this table is set up for breakfast. You can see the loggers here have the pots for their coffee. The good coffee is called the mud, and the bad coffee is called the tar. And just like that, along those lines, the loggers had names for their cook. If they really liked their cook, they called him a mulligan mixer. But if they hated their cook and he made awful food, they called him a bean burner or a can open artist. So one of their favorite breakfasts was monkey blankets, cackleberries, and fly bread. And I'll tell you what those are. A monkey blanket is actually a pancake. A cackleberry is an egg. And fly bread is raisin bread. And the reason they called it fly bread is they weren't sure if they were all raisins. So when the loggers came in here, they had assigned seating. So the most important men in the camp who had the most dangerous jobs, the high riggers and the fallers, they sat at the front of the table and they were fed first. They got the most food. If they were having a chicken, they were the one that got the drumsticks, that sort of thing. And the new guys in the camp, who were called the whistle punks, usually the youngest members, they sat here at the back and they didn't get as much food, and it was usually cold by the time it got to them. When they were in here, they were not allowed to talk, because if you're talking, you can be arguing, and if you're arguing, you're not eating. And the dining hall was not a place to socialize. The dining hall was a place to come in and refuel. The loggers called this place the dentist's office because the filer, who's the man who worked here, sharpens the teeth on the saws. So the saw here in the vise and the saws behind me on the wall are called crosscut saws. And these saws were developed just for cutting down the large trees that we have here on the west coast of British Columbia. So they have 4 cutting teeth in a row, which are sharpened on opposite sides. And then in between the teeth, they have this thing called a raker. And the raker clears out all the sawdust and debris so your saw doesn't get stuck when you're cutting down the tree. So how it would work is the loggers would go out into the woods and select their tree that they were going to cut down. and they would cut notches with their axes into the base of the tree. They wouldn't cut the tree down at the bottom because the bottom of the tree is often where a lot of the sap or pitch of the tree resides, which would gum up their saws. And also the butt of the tree is often a lot wider than the rest of the trunk. So if they cut it down at the bottom, they'd have flared ends at the bottom of all their trees, and it would be very hard to handle the logs, to put them onto rail cars or to sort them once they were in a log boom. So they would cut these notches in about this high off the ground, and then they would wedge in springboards, one on either side, and then standing on these springboards, they would hold the saw, one on each side, and pull back and forth to cut down the tree. And it can take anywhere up to 6 hours to cut down some of the huge trees we had here on the West Coast. But it was worth it because they would get thousands and thousands of board feet out of any one log. We have a tree here in our forest at the BC Forest Discovery Centre out in the woods. It's about 300 years old. It's a Douglas fir, and there's enough wood in that one tree to build a 3-bedroom house. And it's only 300 years old, so you can imagine how much wood they were getting from these trees that were thousands of years old. Some other interesting things here in the filer shop. We have one of the very first chainsaws to be used in the woods of British Columbia. This chainsaw here is from 1936, and they were universally hated by all the loggers because, for several reasons. First of all, they're very heavy, so you can imagine trying to haul this around in the forest as opposed to a crosscut saw. It's for 2 people to operate. One person stands at the front and guides the blade, and the other person stands at the back and hangs on for dear life to the motor. This is the surveyor's shop. The surveyor's job is to go out and map the area that the logging company is going to be logging. So the surveyor, despite having a desk, is not what we call an ink slinger. He's not someone who spends all day in an office doing paperwork. He's out in the woods. So which is why we have lots of things in here to show that he is a man who spends time outside. He has a backpack with a thermos and a canteen so he can go on long hikes. He has a cot so he can set up camp and spend a couple days out in the woods. And he has homemade snowshoes and homemade skis with wooden poles, because up in the mountains there could be snow year-round and he would need some way of getting down the mountain quickly. So the surveyor is doing all his work without the aid of modern conveniences like GPS or satellite imagery or even radio communication or cell phones. This is the Timekeepers Office. The timekeeper is the best paid man in the camp. He's making $5.50 in 1936. And the reason he's the best paid man in the camp is he has one of the most important jobs. He's in charge of payroll. So you always try to stay on good terms with the timekeeper or something might be missing from your next paycheck. And he's also in charge of tracking the stumpage and royalty fees that were paid to the government for every log that was cut. So that's why he has this typewriter here with the extra wide carriage for working on large accounting documents. And he also has an adding machine, so a primitive form of a mechanical calculator for doing all of the accounting work. Because the timekeeper has all sorts of important and sensitive documents that belong to the operations of the logging camp, he has a safe. This safe is actually from a logging company. It's from the Shawnigan Lake Lumber Company. And there's nothing in it anymore, but they would have had any money on site, any valuables, and the documents that said they had the right to harvest the trees on the land they were working on. Across from the timekeeper's office, we have the first aid room. And that's because the timekeeper is also the first aid attendant. This isn't because he necessarily knows anything about first aid. It's because he's the only man that they can guarantee will be in the camp all day long. So logging was and remains a very dangerous job. And injuries were more frequent than the logging company would have liked, or I'm sure the loggers would have liked either. But if something happened, for example, let's say you're out in the woods and you slip and fall and break your leg. They would carry you out of the woods on a spine board or a stretcher, and they would bring you here. The first aid attendant would consult his library of first aid books that he has and figure out what he could do for you. He also has some basic first aid supplies, some things that you will recognize from our first aid kits today. However, for a broken leg, they would probably have to take you into the nearest hospital, and they would do that either in a crummy, which is a crew truck, or a speeder, which is kind of like a bus on rails. It's a one-car motorized unit. But I don't know about you, but if I had a broken leg, spending an hour traveling over a bumpy logging road to have it set at a hospital would be an agonizing experience. So welcome to the bunkhouse. This is where the loggers slept. Now this is considered a pretty nice bunkhouse because it has 4 beds and it has windows. Some of the bunkhouses did not have windows, and some of them had bunk beds. So instead of 4 beds, there would be 8. And some really awful bunkhouses even had triple bunks. So you can imagine you've just spent all day working in the woods, you're wet, cold, tired, hopefully not hungry because you've had dinner, but you have to come in here and sleep with 11 other people. Now the bunkhouses were not a place to spend your spare time. This was a place you came to sleep because they smelled awful. The loggers didn't have access to regular bathing, so the only way they were having a bath was if they went and jumped out in the lake or in the river, and if they wanted their clothes washed, well then you jump in wearing them. So this was not a place they spent their spare time. They would spend that out in the rec hall, which is attached to the dining hall, or they would spend it outside. So when they're in the woods, the loggers are wearing several different types of clothing. They wear their long underwear or their long johns, which you can see here. And they also wore flannel shirts or woolen shirts that they boiled in a mixture of water and linseed oil, and this made them water resistant. Some of the loggers had specialized equipment that they used when they were working in the woods. So you can see here a rope and belt belonging to a high rigger whose job it is to create spars. And he also wears special leg irons, which you can see on the floor here. And he straps them to his legs, and the metal spike helps him dig into the tree as he's walking up so he doesn't fall down. Now you don't have a lot of personal space when you come to a logging camp. All you have is your bed, perhaps some room underneath to put a trunk, and a shelf to put some of your belongings. So loggers didn't bring a lot of personal belongings with them to the camps. Women first came to the logging camps in the 1930s, and they lived in their own bunkhouses, which were called the Queen's Palaces. And their jobs were primarily doing laundry or working in the kitchen in the cookhouse, so they would have the job of a flunky or a kitchen mechanic.